I just got back from the second largest paper vintage event of all time. Welcome back, vintage gamers, to a tournament report. My experiences at Eternal Weekend North America 2025, a 420 player paper sanctioned vintage event. So I went into this tournament with pretty public knowledge that this was going to be my deck list. This is the same idea I've been playing for months now on Magic Online, and it's Lurrus, Jeskai, Paradoxical Outcome, tuned to be somewhere along the combo control spectrum, leaning a little bit more towards control than typical. Not all the way towards like the control area where maybe Brian Koval ended up, but similar ideas. Utilizing the small amount of flex slots that are in this deck to help combat maybe a metagame that has more creatures than normal. So I'm looking at things like the one Swords to Plowshares main, the one Dress Down main, the one Chain main. All of these are going to help me unlock my Paradoxical Outcomes and my stock ups and be able to win with 4th Erlingus. That's the whole goal. I've been very happy with the one Soul Guide Lantern main. That is going to allow me to steal some game ones against Dredge in a different way than just winning by combo. And then I am still on the 4 Flooded Strands to support planes in the board. The planes in the board really is because you want to cast multiple white spells against Lurrus, Frog, and Mono White Initiative. You want to be able to cast Swords of Plowshares over and over again. You want to be able to pass multiple portable holes, that kind of thing. Planes allows you to do that without getting wastelanded. So that's the basic idea of this deck. I trimmed down to 2 Pyroblasts because I was really unhappy with the 3rd Pyroblast for the same kind of reason as the Swords of Plowshares needs that planes to cast multiple white spells. If you want to cast Flame of Anors and two, like say it's 2 Pyroblasts and a Flame of Anor in the same game, and you're up against, I don't know, Null Rod Wasteland out of Frog, it can be quite hard to do that. So less red spells because of the, you could put a 3rd Volcanic Island into this deck. I didn't choose to do that, so that's how I ended up on 2 Pyroblast. I will say that the multiple Soul Guide Lanterns were very helpful. They do improve the Dredge matchup significantly in a way that I didn't think they did previously. So that was kind of like a misjudgment on my part, where I thought, maybe these Soul Guide Lanterns weren't doing enough for the Dredge matchup, and I kind of have come back on that idea and have the Soul Guide Lanterns, especially when you know you're going to face Dredge. Dredge is going to be a part of Eternal Weekend in paper, so I did choose to cut the 4th piece of Dredge hate, which was going to be a Tormod's Crypt, instead played a Mindbreak Trap to just give me a little bit more game against the mirror and against combo. So yeah, nothing crazy here, nothing new, nothing super innovative. I did try Mystic Remora. I didn't like Mystic Remora for what I was trying to do with the deck. I think if you end up like even further on the controlling side of the combo control spectrum, then Mystic Remora starts to make more sense, but I felt like it didn't really line up against the metagame that we were expecting at Eternal Weekend. And the metagame that we were expecting at Eternal Weekend mostly came true with a couple notable surprises. So let's dive in. Going into Eternal Weekend, I said that Frog is the deck to beat, and Frog was what players showed up with. 46 players played the Esper Lurrus Frog deck, and another 26 players played the blue-black Frog deck. Combine those 2 meta shares to a 17.2%, the largest meta share among any deck in Vintage. Even larger than, some archetype level meta shares like Shops or Bazaar. There were more Lurrus Frog decks than, say, Bazaar decks or Shops decks at Eternal Weekend. Together, those 2 decks performed incredibly well. With actually the blue-black version being the less popular version, outperforming the Esper version, but both versions performed over 50%. They were the frontrunner decks, and they performed like the frontrunners. They are sitting there around that like best deck in the format. Keep an eye on it. Kind of win rate 54% is very normal to be the best deck in the format, and 55% is typically what over long periods of time, over lots of data, is typically what Magic Online, not Magic Online, what Wizards says is a target for possible restrictions and things like that. Now, this is of course a lot less data. This is only one tournament with 420 players. Now, it's a very large tournament, but it's still only one tournament. When we start to think about the data we have for Magic Online and tournaments on Magic Online, you start to have hundreds and thousands of matches of data. And then if you added leagues, you're at millions of matches of data. This is just one tournament. And so even if this win rate was something extremely high, say like 60%, even that wouldn't be, one tournament does not make concrete data set. That being said, this is the best deck of the field, and it performed like the best deck in the field. I will say that the most played deck via the entire, even broken down, is simply Esper Frog at 46 players, and a very, very solid 53% win rate. So best deck performed as well. The second most played deck in the field, Mono White Initiative. Mono White Initiative here, 10% of the metagame. Maybe we should look at what's currently going on in the metagame so we can see how this compares. If we look at, say, since Tezzeret, I think that's a good data set. Enough matches have been played since Tezzeret now. We've had, 63,000 matches since Tezzeret. That doesn't sound right. I think that's our whole data set. Yeah, here we go. It's loading up. Oh, wait. Maybe that is still right. Just give Google Sheets a second to parse my information for me. I think this is the full data set, if I had to guess. So since Tezzeret has been printed, we have had 46 different pieces of Magic Online data, and that was 12,000 matches of Magic, which is 1/6 of the total data set since Saga's restriction. And so if we're looking at the last 3 months or so since Tezzeret was introduced into the format, Mono White Initiative has been 17% of the online metagame. So we're looking at a paper metagame that has 7% less initiative. Now, I think if you were to do something like look at the last 45 days, then you have seen Mono White Initiative trend downward on Magic Online, but not by very much, 16.5%. So Mono White Initiative, almost half as many players as normal were playing Mono White Initiative. If we're looking at the 17% Esper combination compared to Magic Online since Tezzeret, 12% plus 7% plus 1 maybe, 19%. So slight decrease in the number of Frog players in paper compared to online. And I think we'll probably see that across the board for the most part. Everything kind of took like a metagame percentage hit, so that because the reason is because of a bunch of unpowered decks. There were lots of unpowered decks in this tournament. If you saw the original post from the coverage team, let's see if I can pull it up here. There was a breakdown, and in that breakdown, you're seeing like a Voke Reanimator, also known as Scam, 18 decks, Red Prison, 16 decks. When you start to introduce these unpowered elements to the format and they start taking up something like 8-10% of the meta share, everything else kind of comes down in response, right? So Mono White Initiative, still the second most played deck, and actually a very good performance for Mono White Initiative, I must admit. I don't know how many of these Mono White Initiative decks are powered versus unpowered. I could probably dig deeper into the data and find that, but I don't have a good script to do that right now. But 51.4% win rate is about where you see Magic Online data for Initiative. Usually it's trending somewhere between 49 and 51. Recently it's been trending down, but this is a slight trend up for a tournament, and so I think a pretty good performance from Initiative. And in fact, most of our top decks had a very good performance, because I do think that is slightly because of what we were talking about earlier with the fact that there are a bunch of unpowered decks. The unpowered decks are traditionally not going to perform very well. They're going to give you a chance to play, and as we'll see later, give you a chance to win. But in general, they're going to underperform, and those will give people an opportunity to have slightly higher win rates with your more established archetypes. Not even just unpowered decks, but even unpolished or bruise or that thing. Like I saw some lands decks floating around, some Reanimator decks, all kinds of cool pet decks that people brought to the event, which I think is super awesome. that can help push up the top end win rate as well. So then you have Lurrus Pio, and Lurrus Pio is very specifically Lurrus Pio decks without Breach. I'll go over that in a second as well. Lurrus Pio decks without Breach, 53.2% win rate as the second most played deck. When you add in the Lurrus Pio decks with Breach, you probably put that Lurrus Pio deck up near those Initiative and Frog numbers. I actually have I think I have a stat somewhere about that. But yeah. So Lurrus Pio, a great tournament for Lurrus Pio, and that makes sense, right? We've established that we think that Lurrus Pio is good versus Frog and good versus Initiative, and if Frog and Initiative are your two most played decks, then Lurrus Pio gets better on the whole. Dredge saw a lot of play. Dredge was 8.6% of the metagame, which is actually less than online right now. Someone asked me to go check that information before I recorded this. Dredge is like 9% of the metagame online, give or take. So like maybe half or 1% difference. But again, total percentage gets dragged down a bit because of unpowered decks. So while there was a significant amount of Dredge, the fourth most played deck in the format in this event, not a crazy departure from online. 49.3% win rate, a very solid win rate, but not a winning win rate, not above 50%. But I don't particularly view 49% win rate as like a bad performance. It's definitely within range of being a reasonable performance. Lurrus Breach, 55% win rate, one of the highest win rates we have among these most played decks, and quite a few Lurrus Breach players. We were looking at 6.4% of the metagame was Lurrus Breach, and I did break that down a little bit because right now there's a lot of differences inside of different Lurrus Breach decks. You can choose to do quite a few different things with the way you build it. And I separated out the data, and of the 27 decks on Lurrus Breach, I tagged 8 of them as Gifts Drain decks, the Sean Dissolutionist style drain decks. Of those 8 decks went with a 57% win rate, bringing up the win rate overall for Lurrus Breach. And then the rest of the decks, the other 19 decks, were a mix of Lurrus Pio Breach and other varieties of Lurrus Breach, like Brian Kelly style Breach. And those lists went 54%. I will say, like, in general, maybe you take some number of those and you bring them into this Lurrus Pio list. So you can slightly prop up the Lurrus Pio data, because there are decks in this Lurrus Breach category that are just Lurrus Pio decks with a Breach win con. And I don't particularly think they're very different from Lurrus Pio with a 4th win con. It's just some, I guess you could say, restrictions inside of the algorithm on what I can and can't do for Magic Online data. I don't have full deck lists outside of top 32, so I can only go on like replays and those kind of things. For this, I could obviously pull out those decks and see, but for online, normally we can't. So we have to, try to keep some kind of consistency. So I think you can generally say that Lurrus Pio decks did very well, whether they were Breach or not Breach, and that doesn't seem that playing 4th as your win con or playing Breach as your win con has a significant effect on your Lurrus Pio deck. And I will say that the Gifts Drain Lurrus Breach deck performed greatly in this field. When you get down to 8 players, you're only looking at 2% of the metagame. So, a highly volatile standard deviation, like plus or minus 10%. But they did perform well, and those pilots did succeed at Eternal Weekend. Oath, the next most played deck. Oath, always wants to see more play in paper and has seen some play online recently. In our recent data set, Oath has been up to 5.5%, which is more than the last few months. It kind of arose on Magic Online as a way to combat Blue-Black Lurrus. Blue-Black Lurrus doesn't have very good tools to beat Oath. So Oath kind of made a comeback, and in paper we saw a significant portion of players on Oath, and they didn't do super well. I would say 48.5% for this metagame share is an underperformance. Online, obviously, they're doing extremely well, 54% since Tezzeret. But that's, again, because there was a pretty polarizing meta share of Blue-Black Online that Oath was exploiting. And when you're only, this is only 3 months or so, this is, a highly volatile plus or minus, right? So, like, All of these things are small data sets, and you have to keep that in mind. And then we move down and we have the blue-black frog players who perform the best. Of the decks that there were a significant play rate, blue-black Lurrus by far the best performing, 56.1% win rate, extremely high win rate, 6% of the metagame. Like you can see down here where we're looking at decks that have a high percentage of the field. Usually, if you wanted to know the back end of these tweets, it's going to be, decks that have more than 5% of the meta share, and then the highest win rates above 51% for those decks. That's what usually ends up in the tweets, just as a quick and easy way to grasp, what decks did well. So we've now gone through all the most played decks, and we talked about how, blue-black Lurrus Control was the best performing, Lurrus Breach of all varieties, and Lurrus PO were the next best, and then even then, Esper Lurrus comes out underneath that. Initiative, again, like I said, a pretty good day for Initiative at 51.4. Then you start to get to decks that are slightly less percentage of the field, less than 5% meta share. Jewel was only 4% meta share, but had a great performance. I kind of put Jewel as a dark horse for this tournament. Jewel is not a deck that's performing or being played very much online, but is a deck that has the power to battle these top metagame players, and it had a great day, 55% win rate. Really, really strong performance from Jewel. Keep an eye on Jewel. Because it can really capitalize on certain metagames based on like where you are in the cycle, like which deck is winning. Things like when Oath becomes the most played deck in the field, then you can really exploit that with something like Jewel. This was the biggest surprise of the event to me. There were 18 decks that were scam decks. Now, scam means Grief Reanimate is what the Magic player base decided is a scam deck. And so I actually had some problems in this data set because what I did is I just put all of the decks that had Grief Reanimate and I put them inside of scam. And inside of scam, there was actually almost a 50-50 split between powered and unpowered. The powered decks being blue-black with Psychic Frog, very similar to the Legacy deck that got banned from that format. There were 10 of those, and those 10 decks did awful. They did 37% win rate. They were really bad. The other 8 decks were non-Force of Will, mostly mono black lists with mostly unpowered, and those decks actually did very well. 55% win rate for those 8 decks that were playing, mono blackish scam. And we actually saw, spoiler alert, a unpowered mono black scam player top 8 this event. Their deck list is something between $800 and $1,000 to build. So a budget mono black scam deck top 8 this event, which I think is so cool. We'll talk maybe a little bit more about that later, or maybe it'll get its own video, maybe a Voice of Vintage video. I haven't exactly decided, but that's something to keep an eye on, is that this scam category has all scam style decks, and so that is split between 2 different decks. Combining those 2, they had, a poor performance, but again, it's mostly because the blue-black powered version is really, really bad. Lurrus Deathrite actually had a pretty strong cult following here in terms of meta share. Lurrus Deathrite had 4% of the meta share, which is, I think, the highest I've ever seen it, but it did not perform very well into this field with only 45% win rate. Another example of paper data, we have 15 players on Red Prison decks. They had a really hard time. Red Prison is just one of the options you can play when you have an unpowered deck to try to battle the field. And I think these unpowered decks, even with the one that top 8'd the event, the mono black deck, these decks are matchup dependent. They're super matchup dependent. They have very polarizing matchups. When you play a deck like Lurrus PO, you're going to have, close to 50% win rate against every deck in the format. When you play a deck like Mono Black Scam, maybe your Lurrus PO matchup is like a 40% win rate, but then your Frog matchup is a 60% win rate, and you have these wild spreads that will your outcome will very much be determined by what do you get paired against. And so like the Mono Black player dodged Paradoxical Outcome for the whole day, basically. And they were able to find a bunch of matchups that were good for them, and they capitalized on that to top 8. And that makes sense because, when you have Frog and Initiative as your most played decks, it could be a very good metagame call to take one of those more polarizing matchup spread decks. So you see a bunch of people playing mostly unpowered Red Prison, 15 players. There was a bunch of Sphere Shops players still. This is paper vintage. No one can get away from Sphere Shops. And there's 14 players, 33% of the metagame, and they had a great time, actually. This is something we've seen online every so often. The metagame gets to a certain spot, and when that certain spot is hit, Sphere Shops becomes a very good choice. Sphere Shops on a deck that benefits from it not being in the spotlight. If Sphere Shops is not the most played deck in the format, then it will have a less hate for it. You can't, I played 0 Hurkyl's Recalls in my PO deck, is the example I always give. And when Sphere Shops was the best deck in the format and I was playing PO, I had 1 Hurkyl's main and 3 in the sideboard. So you get kind of things like that when you start to get down to these, smaller metagame shares. And I think we'll keep going for the metagame shares around, 10 players here. Bug, 14 Bug players, but Bug had a horrendous tournament 40% win rate. One of the worst win rates of any of the decks that were played a lot. One of the worst win rates in the tournament at all. So Bug and Lurrus Deathrite Shaman together both did not perform really well, even though they've had a bit of a resurgence online recently. For whatever reason, Bug did not really work out. Raker Shops, which is a deck that people are, has a kind of a cult following. People really enjoy that deck. Actually, the Raker Shops players did just about as well as the Initiative players. So 51.5 win rate. So a very solid performance for Raker Shops. It's a really cool deck. It's a really interesting deck. It's hard to line up into the metagame sometimes, but when it does, it's a pretty powerful deck, and it's definitely fast enough to work inside the format. Just 2 more decks I think we'll talk about with Doomsday and Countervine. Very small play percentages here, which is kind of how it goes these days. 2% of the metagame for Doomsday, 2% of the metagame for Countervine, though there was another 6 players on Lurrus Doomsday. So if you combine that, maybe up to 4%. Doomsday players who were playing Lurrus did okay, while Doomsday players that were playing no Lurrus struggled, and as did Countervine players. But there were, some players who had decent performances on, in those sides of those archetypes. It was really, there's a lot of variance inherent in a 420 player event. So a quick look at some of the top decks in this format. As I showed on Twitter, we have a top 8 with 8 different decks. This is a top 8 with 8 different decks. Now, this is not a metric that I particularly like. I think that, you see 8 different decks in the top 8. It looks really nice, but top 8ing is sometimes I like to look at more like records that had top 8 potential. Like look at that, because you can sometimes have another 7 decks outside the top 8, and maybe all 7 of those decks are Lurrus Frog decks. But either way, the top 8 you can see here: Mono Black Grief, an Esper Lurrus, Blue Black Lurrus, a Bug deck in the hand of Max Gilmore, Dredge, Sphere Shops, Raker Shops, and Initiative. Really diverse looking field. And to be fair, if I use my own metrics here, this is a very diverse field as well. 17% Frog is as the highest most played, and then from there it only goes down. So yeah, you have Initiative taking it down. Really cool story. Not a typical Vintage player, is working his way into playing Vintage. Really nice guy. I got to talk with him for a little while. He picked up a bunch of power off of this win, and he is looking forward to playing Blue Deck at his next Eternal weekend. So congrats to Jeremy. Really cool story of someone entering the format, giving it, finding a couple of pieces of power to get lent, and playing Initiative to a victory. This top 8 was pretty stacked. Dave Kaplan and Max Gilmore both come back from last year's top 8s. Max had 1 last year, and Dave Kaplan was in the top 8 as well. Both of them playing different fair Lurrus decks, Blue Black and Deathrite Shaman in this case. There was a Dredge deck in the top 8. I just ruined my data sheet. Like I said, the Mono Black Unpowered Scam deck, Raker Shops, Sphere Shops, then slightly outside of the top 8, all the way down to top 16 were players with 8 wins. And we're seeing, another couple Frog decks. There was a Goblins player. This is a Goblins player. I have met him. He's a true diehard Goblins player, and always very impressive with the deck, because it's not an easy deck to pilot into this metagame with all these Frog decks, all these removal spells. So shout out to Robin here with that Goblins deck. That's probably the most interesting deck inside of the top 16 here. Goblins is definitely nice. As you can see, it's not even a name deck in my datasheet anymore. That's how few Goblins get played on Magic Online. So Goblins, Jewel, and then you start to see some Lurrus PO decks and Lurrus Breach decks. Those start to appear here at the bottom of the top 16. And this is a thing I always want to stress. Like, look at this: Lurrus PO, Lurrus PO, Lurrus PO, Lurrus Breach. Someone had said in the Discord, "Oh wow, this tournament was an underperformance for Lurrus PO," and it really wasn't. Lurrus PO actually had a great tournament. You know, one of the most played decks, 53% win rate. Just because a deck doesn't top 8 doesn't mean the deck underperformed. And sometimes, just because a deck top 8s doesn't mean the deck overperformed or performed even well. There's a cool example recently. There was an MTGO top 8 with 3 Dredge players in the top 8, and everyone's like, "Oh wow, Dredge! What a great performance for Dredge!" And the Dredge deck was actually a 44% win rate for the field. It was just by far the most played deck. And so, if you play a deck with enough people play a deck, then you have a high enough chance of someone randomly gets there into the top 8. Anyways, I would not mean to spend this much time on the data portion of this, but I think people want to know what happened at Eternal Weekend, so I'm glad that we got to do that. Next, I want to just talk about my event, my weekend. I have a lot of crazy stories from my 10 rounds of Vintage in the main event, and let's get going. All right, so some of you may have noticed that my name isn't appearing anywhere in this top 32. And that's because I think I had maybe the worst performance at an Eternal Weekend Vintage that I've ever had. I ended up in this tournament at 5 wins and 5 losses. But like I sometimes you win in Magic and sometimes you lose in Magic, and you have some amount of control over that. I actually think in general I was really happy with my play this weekend, and we'll go through all the matches and I'll talk about all the cool and fun and interesting points we found along the way. Let's see. Starting on Thursday, we flew in and played in the trials events for buys. I started the first trial with a round 1 win against Dredge using that Soul Guide Lantern in the main. And then round 2, I ended up dying to Sphere Shops where I couldn't really get out of a lock fast enough. I ended up playing in one more trial where it fired with 16 players. So I got the round 1, everyone got a round 1 buy. And then in round 2, I actually don't have this written down. All I know is that actually, we should probably be able to find it. So what I chose to do this time is I took notes for the main event for Vintage, and that was the only notes I took. But basically, I won 2 rounds of the trial, and then in round 3, I had 3-0. I got paired up against Dan, who's a friend and my teammate in my Airbnb on the same 75. He ended up winning that mirror and then went on to win the finals of that trial. So Dan started with a bye in the main event, and I had no bye in the main event. So round one, we are paired up against Eric. Eric is ELD. Eric is the owner of the card shop ELD, which you see very often here in the banner underneath my camera. So he's my local game store owner. We play a lot. And he is usually playing Jewel Shops. So I knew right away, round 1 feature match, that I was playing up against Jewel Shops. Game 1, I ended up with a Molda 6 and a pretty solid hand, all things considered. It was a very mana-heavy hand, Mana Crypt, Soul Ring, Mana Vault, turn 1 stock up. And I turned that into a trainer, and I have Force of Will. Unfortunately for me, Eric came down with something like 8 mana on turn 1, including Lotuses and Crypts and those things. And what I chose to do is he cracked blue off of Lotus and went for a PO for 2. And I forced this. I think I was forced to force it. I don't think it gets much better from that spot from me. So I forced the PO, and he says that's fine, and uses the other 4 mana from that he still has on turn 1 to resolve a One Ring. So now I'm on the clock. I need to combo off before my opponent draws too many cards from the One Ring. This is achievable, by the way. This is definitely something that could happen. I get to go to my turn and kick my Thundertrap Trainer, because my hand at the time that I forced was Trainer, Force. So I only kept, I get to keep 1 Trainer. And so if my Trainer can hit me something like, I don't know, it has to be like Sapphire, Opal, Lotus Petal, or sorry, Sapphire, Opal, or Lotus, and then a PO. I can absolutely turn that into a PO combo, draw through my deck, bounce my opponent's permanents, and then pass the turn with 7 counters and win the game that way. So still a very winnable game. I kick my trainer. And my trainer just completely whiffs. My trainer hit a Ruby and a Flusterstorm, and those were like the only good spells. And so then I'm defenseless. I have no cards to combo. My opponent untaps and casts a Tinker and Volt Keys and wins. And then game 2, another mulligan to 6. I probe my opponent's hand and see Defense Grid, Jet, Ring, Soul, the One Ring, Soul Ring, Workshop, and Mana Vault. So another huge, like, super mana heavy opener. I have the turn 1 consigned to memory to stop the grid. And then I'd use a turn 2 kick a trainer. So, another mana heavy hand for me. So I can't really complain that I didn't have very powerful hands. Like I had very powerful hands. It's just my opponent had a little bit better ones. So I kick my trainer into Force of Will blue card. But because we know my opponent only has a grid left. Only has a ring left. But unfortunately, he had ripped a jewel off the top of the library, which I forced a negation, and then I miss on a PO or a stock up or anything on the next turn, and I die. We did talk about it a little bit because it was possible that maybe I wanted to let the ring resolve and then try to negation the follow-up, because I have a trainer in play that I had kicked, so I could theoretically steal the ring possibly. But if my opponent hits, anything like even like a metamorph, right? I can't even negate a metamorph, so I'm not sure 100% if I should have, risked it there. Especially when I still have the ability to, untap after countering the jewel and go for like a stock up or a PO or something that can actually produce, pushing my game forward. So, not sure in that case. But either way, I lost a quick 2-game set to Eric here to start the tournament 0-1. So round 1 feature match, round 1 loss. No good for me. Round 2, we're up against Joe L. Joe L was someone we played against in Steel City. Joe wasn't sure he was able to play this event, but he actually had a friend who was able to let him borrow power. And this is his favorite deck. This is his baby. This is his Reanimator / Show and Tell deck. 4 Show and Tells, Reanimate, Shallow Grave, Consigned to Memory, a bunch of Moxen, and Archon, Atraxa, Emrakul, Griselbrand, Shieldred. Really, really cool deck, and always really fun match up against Joe. Game 1, I led on Mox Lorien, and then I had a Flusterstorm up, so I flustered Joe's Ponder. Then I scrolled for an Ancestral. He was a little bit slow out the gate. I was able to snap my Fluster back, but this time it was actually I snapped a Fluster on a Show and Tell. But Joe had rightfully assumed that I would do that, and there was actually no Show and Tell target at all in Joe's hand, just a bunch of other Show and Tells. But I basically run away with the game from that point because I'm casting Ancestral and drawing way more cards and that kind of thing. Game 2, Joe hit me with a sideboard tech, the classic Boseiju Who Shelters All. Now that is not the green Boseiju, that is the Cavern Boseiju. And boy, is my deck unprepared to beat a Cavern Boseiju. So Cavern Boseiju in game 2, man, I really couldn't play the controlling game. And so there was a resolved stock up that was uncounterable. And so I kind of focused on trying to put it forward like a combo kill. And because I focused on trying to put forward a combo kill, I didn't ever end up finding another blue card for my force. So even when Joe went for an Entomb that wasn't uncounterable, I didn't have a force for it. And so the Entomb resolved, and the Shallow Grave was uncounterable. And I did have a Dress Down to try to stop the Griselbrand, but Joe had to force my Dress Down. Used the Griselbrand, attacked with the Griselbrand, drew a bunch of cards, and then consigned the Griselbrand Shallow Grave trigger at the end of the turn. And I did die. And I got to go to my turn where I did have a lethal 4th Aerolingus, a very, very like X equals 10 4th Aerolingus. And I was definitely, I put a win on the stack, but Joe had a bunch of counters from drawing with Griselbrand, obviously. So we go to game 3. Game 3 comes around, and I just have a broken Tolarian Academy draw, like with a turn 1 Lurrus, and I got my stock up Thoughtseize, but it doesn't really matter because I have a Dress Down in my hand, so I get to use my Lurrus and do a Dress Down loop every turn, drawing tons of extra cards and kind of running away with a victory, just basically on the power of my Lurrus draw. And that's of course why we play the PO deck in the first place. Is it is powerful enough to get those free wins. So I took that round 2 victory to start my uphill climb to try to recover in this event, and I'm now 1-1. Go on to round 3 here versus Doug. This is another Jewel deck. Game 1 was a high power Academy hand with where I probe my opponent, and there are 2 payoffs. I counter the first, but then when I tried to counter the second payoff, he had drawn Force for turn, and so the Jewel resolved. And there was nothing in play besides my trainer. So theoretically, my trainer could attack and steal the Jewel. I go to attack and steal the Jewel, and it gets Talon Gates. So I wasn't able to steal the Jewel, but it looks like besides that, Doug had not hit a ton of threats, and I was still able to claw my way out of that game. And then game 2 was a very uninteresting game where I had a pile of Force of Wills and my opponent just didn't have a lot of action. So not the most entertaining Jewel matchup, but sometimes, that's how it goes. Take the win there and move on to round 3. Round 4, I should say, up against Shaw. And this was my first Frog matchup of the day, my first Lurrus matchup of the day. I always regret not playing against more Lurrus decks because I do really enjoy them. But this was my first Lurrus matchup of the day. This is the blue-black Frog deck, a bunch of Spell Pierces, some Ponders. And we played a cool 3-game set, I believe. Oh yeah, this was a really cool 3-game set. And I am reading my notes and I'm remembering it. And so game 1, I have a very tempo-oriented hand where I'm flustering a Spell Pierce on the draw, on a draw to 2. So I played an early PO maybe, or maybe it was an early Flame of Anor or something like that. And there was a Spell Pierce. Yeah, so I remember now. I probed and saw a Spell Pierce, and I actually got him to use the Spell Pierce so I could use my Fluster so I could draw 2. Where then I follow it up with like a Sync on an early Psychic Frog and play a small 4th and win with the 4th. It was actually a game that I could have lost, and actually one of the mistakes I actually recognized from the tournament, because I had lost like 4 Mana Crypt flips straight, so I was at very, very low life total and almost dead to this Frog. And I could have made sure I wouldn't have died to my Mana Crypt on a Frog attack if I had attacked with my Lurrus as well on my big 4th Aerolingus swing. Because I needed basically I needed 2 swings with the 4th Aerolingus because my opponent wasn't at a low enough life total. And if I had attacked with my Lurrus, I couldn't have died to my own Crypt flip. But that didn't end up happening. So I did take a game 1 win. Game 2, there was a strip mine on my basic, and the strip mine on my basic put me way too far behind. I had basic island and basic plains out, got my basic island strip mine, so I still had basic plains to portable hold and null rod, but it just wasn't enough. Didn't have enough mana, and so we had to play a game 3, and game 3 was crazy. So I had like a really powerful start, got out to a good opener, and my opponent had resolved a Bowmaster on turn 2. Or maybe it was turn 3, and scries with the Surveil land. Surveils. And my opponent's face was very confused. I don't know exactly how to explain it. My opponent was like, I have no idea what I'm going to do with this. And I'm like, okay, so he definitely has a Twister on this Surveil. And so I asked my opponent while he's surveilling, I was like, are we casting that Twister? it was just a great reaction phase. We had a really fun match together. And he goes, yeah, I'm going to do it. And so he keeps the card on top, untaps, and casts Twister. And I'm very ready for this. My hand is Swords, Pyroblast, and so I want this Twister to resolve. I mean, I don't want this Twister to resolve with a Bowmaster in play because then I'll die. But if this Twister resolves with the Bowmaster out of play, then it refills my hand and gives me a good chance to win the game. So with the Twister on the stack, I cast Swords on the Bowmaster. He responds with a Mental Misstep on my Sword. So actually, I think it makes a lot of sense for him to go for the win because he has that Mental Misstep covering Swords. Unfortunately for him, I have the Mental Misstep covered with my Mental Misstep. So I Mental Misstep his Mental Misstep, and I still have a Pyroblast at the end of all this, just in case. And then with Pyroblast being my last card in hand and Orcish Bowmaster being off the field, the Twister resolves. The Twister resolves, and I have the weirdest hand of all time. My hand is Force of Will, 4 Theralingas, Tolarian Academy, and 4 Pieces of Power, all Moxen and Lotus. So at end step, I use my Surveil land, and I bin a land, and I untap, and unfortunately, I draw another land. So I play all my mana out, and I have a Lurrus at this point, I'm pretty sure. And so I go Lotus Lotus, and I make a lethal 4 Theralingas, so it's like a 4 Theralingas for like 10 or something. But I also still have 5 leftover mana to hardcast Force of Will, and 2 leftover mana to pay for a possible Spell Pierce. So I'm feeling pretty good. I'm like, okay, I have a lethal 4 Theralingas for sure. Unfortunately, my opponent's Twister gave him Force blue card, Spell Pierce. So my lethal 4 Theralingas gets countered, and I'm at nothing. I'm sitting there with nothing going on. And so for a couple turns, I'm drawing blanks. I'm like, come on, please draw me a stock up, draw me a trainer, draw me anything. And my opponent's just like drawing Bowmasters and these kind of things, and has a Bowmaster in play. And on like probably the last possible turn, I rip a Paradoxical Outcome. I'm at 11 life, and there's a Bowmaster in play. So I just PO for 7, draw a bunch of cards, portable hole the Bowmaster, and then I keep POing off and win the game. And so that was probably one of the more fun and crazy matches of the whole tournament. So shout out to Shah. That was a good time. Oh man, I think that's my favorite story of the whole event is the Twister that fought over the Source to Plowshares. Just a wild one. Then we had Olivier, who was a PO Mirror. This was a pretty cool matchup too. I have to say, I think all 10 of my opponents in Vintage were just great opponents. It was a ton of fun to play Magic with them, which is, if you have fun playing Magic, then it's not, it doesn't hurt as much when you lose. And whether you win or lose, if you had fun doing it, then just makes it even better. So we played a PO Mirror. These games I don't think weren't particularly close. That's just sometimes how the PO Mirror goes, not really like to the fault of the pilot or anything. But the first game was pretty close, but I don't think they had enough blue. Was this a 3-game set? Or was this a 3-game set? I'm trying to like parse through my notes here. Yeah, I don't have actually very good notes for this one. I know that the game 1 was a close one, but there wasn't enough blue mana after a stock up, so I couldn't protect the PO, and I died. Okay, that's all I have written down. So I guess I lost game 1. Game 2, oh no, I died to 4 Theralingas Tempo. That's what I died to. Okay, I understand now. Some of these games are just they all very different. So sometimes you cast a 4 Theralingas for 2 early and protect it and win. Game 2 was very different in that I went for a Saga gaming, where I had an early turn 1 Saga, made constructs, and found a Vexing Bauble off of the Saga trigger. And my opponent just like has a hand of all interaction and can't do anything. And so I end up winning that game. And then game 3 was my opponent had unfortunately mulliganed a couple times, and then they kept a hand that was all permission, and I had another bobble hand, and then from there they just hit more mana and more everything, and they just weren't able to come back. So I think the game 1 was probably the closest, and then the games 2 and 3 were a bit one-sided, but it was a fun matchup all the same. So now I'm on the up and up here. I've won 4 straight matches. I'm now 4-1, and I get an off-camera feature match versus Chris. So in this off-camera feature match, Chris is on Dredge. This is actually, I believe it's the Dredge player who I beat in round 1 of the trial on the previous day. So here in round 6 at 4-1, we're up against Dredge, and oh boy, did my opponent smoke me with some 7-card keeps. So I have these one written down because they were fresh in my mind. Chris hit me with the keep 7, double Bazaar, double Hollow 1, Force of Will, Mental Misstep. I chose to counter the second Hollow 1, and that was okay, but then he forced my Lantern, main deck Lantern. And I couldn't get Urza's Saga blockers fast enough, and I just died. Game 2, he kept 7, but my hand was quite good this time. I had a turn 1 stock up into a turn 2 Lantern, and I was able to slowly grind my way through double Hollow One. The Hollow Ones were bait for my Force of Will, but I just didn't take the bait because I thought I could beat 2 Hollow Ones. And so then when he went for Force of Vigor on my Soul Guide Lantern, I just forced that, and then I used I killed both Hollow Ones by casting Flame of Venor on Shatter Draw 2. So like just extreme value game. So that game felt really good. So we went to game 3, and in game 3 he kept 7, and he went turn 1 Hollow 1 and grief my Moldasix and take my 1 Lantern, and I die. It was not close. I was really happy with myself though, because my 7 was like an ancestral 7 that was like very suspect but has ancestral recall, and I feel like I very disciplinedly mulliganed that that hand, and by mulliganing that hand gave myself a chance to win. Unfortunately, my 6-card hand did not really beat a grief, so it didn't actually end up mattering very much. But I think it was still it was still, you know, I made the right play even if it didn't work out in the end. So now I am 4-2, and I definitely need to win all the rest of my matches to put myself in a good spot for the end of the day. And I'm up against Chase. Chase is the name I've seen all around, and I've seen him at different kind of events and things. And Chase just kicked my ass. That's all I can really say there. I kept like a land heavy hand that had a Mana Crypt, a Force of Will, early Lurrus. And I like to keep those hands in the Lurrus mirror because, have the Force, and you can, if you have the Crypt, means you can always cast the stock ups and the trainers and the POs. So unfortunately for me, my opponent went DT for Volt Key with Force backup on like turn 2, and I just died. I had my Force, and it was not enough. Game 2 was different from that though. Game 2 was a super heavy mana trainer hand, and my trainer found a PO and like won basically on the spot. Game 3, I kept a suspect hand on the draw, but my hand had like 3 forces, a trainer, a ruby, and a misstep. So like I have good game against early like powerful plays with my misstep. I have some forces to buy me time, and the minute I find any blue source, I'm going to cast a trainer and power through there. And so I kept it, and I was able to counter like the first 4 things that my opponent did, but I did miss on a blue source for like 7 turns. So eventually I ran out of counters, and a stock up happened, and I died. Maybe that's a mistake from my side. Maybe I'm not supposed to keep that kind of hand. But also, I think if I find a blue source in the first couple draws, like even the first like 3 draws, I think I was actually in really good shape in that game. So I don't know if that was a mistake in mulliganing or some bad variance, or maybe a little bit of both. It can always be a little bit of both. So that's my 3rd loss. I am out of top 8 contention, and I am down to play the rest of the tournament out. Basically, I still want to play more Vintage. I was having a really good time, so I went and played more Vintage. We got Romy here, who had this was a cool one too, because I had no idea that my opponent was on Dreadnought after game 1. So game 1, I kept a bit of a sus hand, I would say. I kept 1 Saga double Mox, and I did miss on extra stuff for a bit. I got Wastelanded on turn 1. And I got misstepped. I was wastelanded, so I was behind, and my opponent played a frog, and I was like, okay, I'm just gonna chain this frog and try to give myself enough turns to figure out a way out of this mess that I put myself in. And the chain did it. The chain got enough turns, so I was able to cast a Paradoxical Outcome, even though I didn't have the mana to beat a Spell Pierce, but I did have the Mental Misstep. So Mental Misstep the Spell Pierce, got a win with a PO. And then game 2, my opponent had a hand that was Mox Land, and I went for a trainer on turn 1 that got Doorkeeper Thralled, so no ETB for me. But then my Vexing Bauble, my Vexing Bauble just won the game by itself. My opponent I had a Vexing Bauble, and then they legitimately had 5 turns in a row where they drew Forces of Will or Negation and Moxen, and so my opponent never really hit that second land that would let them play the Frog, and from there they just couldn't get out of that own mana lock from Bauble. So unfortunate sets of games there, but some pretty funny ones when you look back on it. Like this Doorkeeper throw was so far out of left field for me. I had no idea that was coming, so it was pretty cool. So I got that win, and now I'm 5-3, and I got 2 more rounds to go. Playing up against Patrick, playing against Patrick all the time. He was on Lurrus Frog this time, and so I'm pretty happy. I'm gonna play my Lurrus Frog matchup, and game 1 was like perfect textbook game. I got ahead with trainers, way overwhelmed him on mana, and basically just like used the stock up to get ahead. And we both were talking about it, and he was talking about how he practiced with Tom Basketball and how it's a tough matchup, and I agree. And game 1 is exactly how it should go. But then I said the magic words that I should never say, and I was, but there are definitely ways you win this matchup, and game 2 and 3 were definitely the ways he won the matchup. So game 2, my opponent's hand was Black Lotus, Ancestral Force of Will, and I basically just got overpowered by restricted cards, which is definitely one of the ways you can always win a blue matchup. And then game 3 was a bit weirder, where I kept a 2-land hand. And I fetched both basics, so I played around Wasteland, and my opponent had 2 Wastelands, so like basics were clutch here. I was able to have mana. The problem was I just never found any more mana. So even though I kept 2 basic lands and Mana Crypt, I was never able to find like any other mana to like cast, red spells. And I drew both Pyroblast and the 4th Aerlingus and a Flame of Anor. And it was just like, oh, these are the worst possibles, and I am super, super dead. So got basically run over here by Patrick on the Frogs in round 9. And then I played a round 10 versus Thomas, and this was pretty cool. I'm sad I lost, but this is pretty cool because this is it's a blue workshop deck, but it is not a jewel deck. It's a classic better jewel deck. No jewels, but we have stock ups. There's a bunch of really cool cards in this list, like Kappa Cannoneer, Lodestone Golem. And Thomas hit me here with the old turn 1 Tezzeret Time Vault with Force of Will protection. So I died on turn 1. And then in game 2, my opponent mulled a 5. And I had a really strong 7, like a heavy interaction hand, was ready to, start countering payoffs. Unfortunately, my heavy interaction hand got soloed by Vexing Bauble. And, my hand with Trap and Force and Negation and stuff, I had to use my Negation on the Vexing Bauble so I could still have Force of Will and Trap. And basically, he was able to resolve a ring. And from there, it's just it's very easy to win when you have the ring in play, and I don't have the necessary pieces to put together a combo win of my own. That's kind of the danger of keeping one of those, heavy interactive hands. So that is all 10 rounds of Vintage Eternal Weekend for me, where I went a pretty rough 5-5 for 149th place. Like I said, I think this might be my worst Eternal Weekend performance all time, but even then, 5-5 is not the end of the world. I did start to hit those Lurrus decks at the end of the tournament, so I guess I played 5 matchups versus Lurrus and 5 matchups versus non-Lurrus. So that's a pretty decent spread. I did play against, those 2 Jewel players, so my Mindbreak Trap paid off, but I also didn't have the Tarmogoyf Crypt to help beat the Dredge player, so that was a little unfortunate. Overall, I do think that this was a good deck list, and I wouldn't be surprised if Eternal Weekend Europe comes around, the metagame hasn't changed, and I play something very similar to this. I, of course, talk with, a bunch of other players who are on Lurrus PO, the Breach variety, the non-Breach variety, Remoras, no Remoras, and in general, everyone kind of agrees that this shell is very strong and very good, but, it's not an overwhelming deck. This deck is not broken or anything. That's, I think, kind of the problem. It's definitely not the most powerful deck. It feels almost like a classic modern Jund deck where you're like 45%, 47% against every deck in the format. So you're able to play all of these matchups, but you aren't able to overpower your opponents in the same way that maybe a Jewel deck or something would do, right? So yeah, like I said, I thought I had a great Eternal weekend from a vintage standpoint. Even if this was my worst performance from a tournament standpoint, like a 10 rounds, great opponents every round. Everyone is having a good time. Everyone is trying to win, obviously, but no one is being unsporting about it. And at least from my experience, and like and I got to see all these people who came to play the format with me. So it was exciting. I will just quickly go over my Legacy experience as well. I did not take notes for Legacy. I decided that 15 rounds of Legacy was too much note taking. I straight up 75-75 copied Brian Koval's list. I put no time into Legacy, and I actually played 0 matches with this deck before the event. So those were not good decisions, obviously, but I strongly believe that you should be only doing things that you think you're going to enjoy and have fun. And at the time, when I had the free time to pursue practicing for this event, I decided to put more effort into Vintage. So this deck is something similar to like the deck I played last year. I played a blue-black Delver deck last year of Echo Baron's creation. I think this might even be the same list iterated on over the course of a year. And I played this over Reanimator because I didn't enjoy playing Reanimator, and I wanted to like maybe tempo out games a little bit more with these Goyfs, and that was nice. But I did think I regretted not like being a little bit more aggressive on my deck choice. This deck is a little bit too close to like a Dimir Lurrus deck in Vintage, where the Lurrus deck is a tempo deck, right? But it's not like a true aggressive tempo deck like a blue-red Delver. So this was a little bit a slower one. It requires you to make a lot of decisions in a game and a lot of correct decisions. And I definitely did not make a lot of correct decisions. I made a lot of correct decisions, but I didn't make all correct decisions. And sometimes you need to like make 7 of 7 correct decisions, and that can be very hard to do. So this was a 15-round tournament. I played all 15 rounds because I started off 2-1 before taking a loss to Sneak and Show. And then I battled back and I won another couple rounds, including a feature match versus Max, who had top 4 over in Vintage and came back here and top 32'd in Legacy. But I was able to take a victory over Max. I think I got lucky, some mulligans, some good tempo plays. I did make a really good ponder in this game that protected like it hid a spell bomb, so that my opponent went for the reanimate plan, and then I had a spell bomb for it. Like hit it from a Thoughtseize. So like, although I made some pretty big mistakes over the course of the weekend in terms of like playing this blue-black deck, I definitely made some ones that I was really happy with, and I was learning as I go. I played against so much Forge and Nadu in this tournament. So much Forge, and I think I played against 4 or 5 different Nadu players and 4 Forge players. The Forge was looking really hard until I was talking with Travis Yu, and Travis had told me, hey, Justin, counter Grim Monolith instead. And apparently that was the key to me turning around these matchups, because in Vintage, you don't count Grim Monolith. They have tons of mana. You want to counter their payoffs. But in Legacy, they don't actually have the mana all the time. And if you have a tempo plan, especially a Wasteland tempo plan, there's only 1 Grim Monolith, but there's like 4 Tezzerats and a bunch of 4 keys. So if you can just counter the Monolith, they won't have enough mana, and then you can tempo them out of the game. So once I learned how to do that, rewrote my heuristics, and I started beating up on those Forge decks a little bit. I will say that this was an off-camera feature match here versus Isaac, which is pretty cool. How did Isaac finish? 9-6. Okay. This was a really cool deck. This was black, white energy stuff, but it was like super mid-range. Like there's 3 Halia, which I learned about in this event, 4 Barrow-Goyf, and 4 Clarion Conqueror. So just dudes and Thoughtseize and Therapy attacking in, and basically an upgraded modern deck almost. Really fun match versus Isaac, where he just kicked me in. I did not have the removal required to beat this many creatures. And that kind of was a prevailing feeling on the day for me. It was these green matchups like the Cephalid Breakfast and the Bant Elves and the mid-range Nadu and all of these decks. I just felt so far behind playing this blue-black deck. I just did not have the tools to like answer all these creatures, and I wasn't putting a fast enough clock and those kind of things. So in the end, I ended up 8-7. So even though I made day 3 at 6-3, so I actually had quite a decent start to the whole tournament. Starting off 6-3, I lost my last round of that day. Then all the wheels fell off in day 2, and I faced Juju Bean, very strong player. We had a really close 3-game set, and I definitely thought that the difference in that set was me and my practice and not playing well, which is always super frustrating because like you had the regret finally sink in round freaking 11, where I'm like, man, if I had just put even a little practice into this deck, I would have probably been able to beat Juju, which is not something you can do every day. So then I hit some like rough matchups and some rough variants and stuff like that. So 8-7. I'm not actually upset about this. I think 8-7 is about where I would expect myself to end up on a no reps legacy deck that required me to cast a bunch of brainstorms. I know that this format is theoretically changing in a month or so with a banner restricted announcement, so I won't be playing any legacy until then. But after the banner restricted announcement, I do think I'm going to be doing some legacy practice. I don't want to go to Europe and Japan having not played my deck as much as I did in this event. I think it's likely that I'll probably maybe try to swap over to like a blue-red tempo deck, because I just want my opponent to die faster. My logic is I'm still a smart player, right? I can resolve brainstorm and ponder well, but if you give me too many opportunities to resolve brainstorm and ponder, eventually I'm going to do something stupid. So I think I'd like my opponent to die a little bit faster than they were doing with this deck, and that's kind of how I feel about it. I will say that I kind of enjoyed it. Like, it was a pretty fun tournament for Legacy overall. I thought the games, especially like the Reanimator matchups, I thought were really fun to play. I was a little bit surprised at like how polarizing some of the matchups were for this like very blue fair deck were. I was hoping it would be more of like my legacy, my vintage deck, where it's like decent against everything. But I had some really struggles. Like, I played against a Beans. Nicholas was on a Beans Yorion control deck, and I just felt like I could never beat that deck. When I played against the Cradle version of Nadu, I felt like I could never beat that deck. I did see that in the data for Legacy that this Black Temple deck did very poorly. So maybe it was just a tough choice to battle with on the weekend. But either way, I wasn't upset about my experience playing Legacy. I thought I had a pretty fun tournament. I had some cool opponents, some really interesting matches as well. These kind of decks tend to provide opportunities to have really interesting back and forth matches. So yeah, short breakdown of Legacy. So yeah, I guess I'm a 50% win rate player now. 5-5 in Vintage and 8-7 in Legacy. Not my best Eternal Weekend tournament wise, but again, I'm gonna keep saying it. I am just always blown away by the amount of people who come up and say hi and say thank you for the content and doing streams and putting up videos. And I can't thank you enough for watching them and hanging out with me and playing the format with me, because without that, there'd be no reason for me to do that. So thank you for everyone who watched and supported and came and said hi. I appreciate getting to meet everyone. So many stories from people who weren't going to play Vintage, decided to borrow some power, won a bunch. Now they're starting to buy pieces of power. People who top 32'd and turned their promos into trade-ins to help start putting power together. I understand that paper Vintage is inaccessible. It is hard to have the cards to play Eternal Weekend, and it's a privilege to play Eternal Weekend. So when I hear these stories about people, trading in their cards and trading in their promos and putting, starting to pick up pieces of power so that the next year they can play with the cards that they want to play with, it's just really, really cool to me. And of course, from my perspective, I'm going to keep pushing for as many events, every event that's not Eternal Weekend, to be some amount of proxies, whether that's unlimited proxy or reserve list or 15 card or whatever. The number one thing that I want is to continue being able to play the format that I love and enjoy, And right now, that format is fantastic. No small exaggerations, no exaggeration to say that Vintage might be the most wide and balanced format in all of Magic right now. I know Pauper is doing pretty well from what I hear, but we'll just say it is, okay. Vintage is in a great spot, and I don't expect anything to change at our next banner restriction announcement. I understand that people see, Lurrus percentages and Lurrus numbers, and they get a little hesitant. But my sincere opinion is that Lurrus is a really good thing for the format. Having these fair Lurrus blue decks at the top gives you the opportunity to metagame as hell, like Mono Black Scam, $800 deck, top 8 Vintage champs. And I believe one of the biggest reasons for that is because of it has a strong matchup into Frog. It has a strong matchup into Initiative as the most played decks in the field, and it gives it an opportunity to flourish. And you can, in these kind of, I won't say stagnant, but solidified metagames where they've been iterated on for a while, those are the places where you can find edges as a deck builder. And I didn't do that, for what it's worth. I stuck with my tried and true because I truly believe that I'll be at my best playing this Lurrus PO deck, whether it's the best deck or not. And it certainly didn't look like the best deck going into the tournament. It was really struggling on Magic Online. But yeah, my main sentiment is that Vintage is in a great place. If you want to learn Vintage and play Vintage, paper players will play you if you have a Black Lotus, and paper players will play you if you have a basic land with the word Lotus and Sharpie on it. All Vintage players want to do is play games with you. And so proxy up those decks in paper, bring them to your local game store, get that rental account for Magic Online, hop in the Vintage Challenge, and we'll keep gaming. I plan to be at Eternal Weekend in Europe, in Italy, and Eternal Weekend in Japan, in Yokohama. And I hope to see anyone who I haven't seen yet there. And I hope everyone has a great, 2 months or so before those things happen. Thank you for watching more Vintage content on this YouTube channel every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'll see you then.